Professor Tore Ellingson, member of the Economic Sciences Prize Committee. Thank you very much for discussing the 2009 Economics Prize with us. Could we begin by you telling us who's been awarded this year's prize?
Yes, this year's prize goes one half to Elinor Ostrom, a political scientist at the University of Indiana, and one half to Oliver Williamson, who is an economist at Berkeley.
And so what have they been awarded the prize for?
Well, Ostrom has been awarded for her work on economic governance, especially the governance of common pool resources, and Oliver Williamson also for economic governance and especially the boundaries of the firm.
And so the prize has been shared this year, and you mentioned the phrase economic governance. What exactly do both halves of the prize have in common?
Well, what they have in common is they try to understand how non-market institutions work and why we have them. And that is something that economists have not been paying as much attention to as to the workings of markets.
And so could you give examples of what non-market institutions are and why it's important to study them?
Oh yes, so Oliver Williamson has primarily been trying to understand the existence of firms, and Elinor Ostrom the existence of associations, in particular groups of users of local natural resources.
And so they're exploring non-market institutions. Was that because it was a particular interest, or were they interested in these institutions, or were they particularly anti-market institutions?
Well, I don't think that you can call any of them anti-market, but it's evident that a lot of resource allocation takes place outside of markets. And no matter whether we like markets or not, we need to understand why that is so. And both in the case of Ostrom and Williamson, they see that there are important efficiencies to be had that you sometimes cannot have in markets.
So if we go through each half of the prize separately, we'll start with the achievements of Elinor Ostrom. What particularly was she studying and why?
Well, her research is very much based on empirical studies of how local natural resources, like pastures, like dams for irrigation, groundwater, woods, fish stocks, you name it. She wanted to understand how user management of those resources actually work in practice.
And that seems like a very interesting field to study. Were there any preconceptions about how these areas are managed?
Yes, and that's important because both in economics and in biology, there was this preconception that common property will always be mismanaged, and hence you have two solutions. Either you split it up, so all property is owned by individuals, or you involve the government, and you have government regulating the usage through, for example, taxes and quotas. And Elinor Ostrom, after performing her own studies and also looking at what other people were finding, she concluded that common property regimes could actually, in many cases, work better than either of the two alternatives that had been proposed.
And do you have any examples of how this works successfully?
Oh yes, there are lots and lots of examples. The challenge is to find the most striking one. So one example I like a lot is grasslands in and around Mongolia, because if you look at the satellite photos, you will see that there are some areas that are clearly green, and then you will see other areas where there's been a lot of degradation, so it looks almost brown. And then you overlay national boundaries, and then you can see that all the green is in Mongolia, whereas the yellow is in China and Russia. where they tried first collectivization, and then at least China tried also privatization. And neither of those classical solutions worked well, whereas the common property regime with mobile herders, the classic way of managing grasslands in Mongolia worked much better from an environmental point of view. And not because they had less animals, there's the same grazing pressure overall, but the traditional methods just worked much better.
It's very interesting that tradition works better than anything that modern management comes up with. But when looking at all these examples of how this works, are there any universal rules to success?
Yes. Ostrom has identified a number of such rules. And what we find maybe most striking are the following two. First, that it matters how rules are being created. It's not just the rule itself, but how it comes to be. If the users themselves are involved in creating the rules tend to work better also. Being more legitimate, you get more compliance with the rule. Second, it also matters how the rules are being monitored and how sanctions are being put into place. Systems work better when users themselves engage in monitoring and also when they engage in sanctioning of free riders.
So when they have a vested interest in what they're doing?
Yes. So having third parties from the outside coming in to do the management does not tend to work as well as when the users themselves are actively engaged.
You briefly mentioned a limitation there. Are there any more limitations to this sort of model?
You mean to...
In which ways may it not work so well?
Well, this is... surely there are, but these are the ones that we think are most striking, most surprising.
And so you've mentioned an example, a very nice example of success at a sort of nationwide level or a quite restricted level. Is this something that can be scaled up? Is there? We talk about common community ideals, but can we expand that to common global ideals? So, for example, with the issues with climate change.
Yes. So this is one of the questions that I know that Elinor Ostrom has been much involved with over the last decade or so. So what we know that we can learn from her work is that you can often scale up from two small communities. They can start cooperating once each of them works well internally. How you can scale it up globally is not absolutely obvious to me, or I think to her. But one guess would be that with all the modern communication technology, some of the tricks that work well in small groups could also work well globally. I think of naming and shaming, for example. With today's technology, something stupid that you do in Stockholm will be known worldwide after just a couple of hours.
Yes, indeed. So if we turn now to Oliver Williamson and his achievements at being awarded the prize, he looked at a very different sector. Could you go into a bit of detail about what he explored and why he was exploring that?
Yes, so his question is really not about user groups or associations, but about commercial firms. He wanted to understand when will you have interaction, when will you have transactions conducted inside the boundaries of the firms, and when would the parties prefer to negotiate their way to an agreement in the marketplace. So that was the big question that had been posed already by earlier laureates, and in particular by Ronald Coase, who got the prize in 91. But Coase only gave a partial answer to this question. Coase said that technology is not going to be the whole answer. You need to understand what is the problems of transacting. Mm-hmm. And what Williamson has done is to flesh out that answer in much more detail so that we can take it to data and see if you can have a theory that stands up in a scientific way.
So how do markets and firms differ in the way they approach the same subject? And what did Oliver Williamson discover that firms do better?
Well, so his argument is that the problem with market interaction is that you need both parties to agree. And that means that I have an incentive to bargain strategically with you and vice versa. We may spend resources on that, and we may, in the end, we may fail to agree indeed because we push too hard. Within the firm, one of us will have authority and will be able to decide. We don't need both parties to agree to everything. So firms are good at resolving conflict. The only question is then, what are firms bad at? And what Williamson argues is that firms are bad at limiting the abuse of power. The central executive officer can resolve conflicts both among subordinates and among others and himself. But it's hard for him or her to refrain from abusing that power.
So you've given a very nice description there of what firms do less effectively. Is Williamson's theories a way of managing ineffective behavior within firms?
Well, yes, it is, because what he says is the following, that if it's very important that you don't disagree, okay, so maybe you have some assets, some knowledge that is only valuable in a certain relationship, so you have what he calls a relationship-specific asset, then you may want to move that inside the boundaries of the firm in order to not risk the costs of disagreement. So this is something that nowadays is being taught at business schools all over the world, that what do you need to think about when you decide to make or buy, or when you decide to engage in a takeover or merger.
So it's something that's been discussed globally and being incorporated by firms all around the world.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Okay. So if we sort of move towards the motivations towards awarding the prize, we discussed briefly what the two halves of the prize share, and as you stated in the announcement, these have been given for theories and discussions that have been occurring some years beforehand. So was there any sort of recent development in both theories, or any recent sort of breakthrough which provided a compelling reason for awarding the prize this year?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that, as is the case most often, there is this gradual corroboration of work. So in Williamson's case, he did much of his work in the 70s and 80s, and then gradually it's been corroborated empirically. There have been other theories, to some extent competing theories, and we want to find out which of those theories are relatively most important, which of them can we feel most confident if we award. So I wouldn't say that there is something dramatic that has happened over, say, the last 5 years. It's just the accumulation of evidence in favor of the theory, and the lack, maybe also to some extent, of some competing theory that would prove him wrong.
And is that something in general that is more complex for something like a field like economic sciences? Because in physical sciences or the biological sciences, one waits for a theory to be proved, but in economics, one not only has to wait for a theory to be proved, but one has to do that within the cycles of human behavior. Does that present more difficulties when it comes to awarding prizes?
Well, yes and no. I think there is a misconception, actually, about the difficulties of testing theories in economics relative to other sciences. If you compare it to medicine, for example, often we live for a very long time before we're sure whether a particular theory in medicine is correct. And think about astronomy, so on and so forth. And there are theories in economics that have been tested down to the last decimal. So yes, I think so. On average, if you compare to physics, for example, we have to live with a bit more uncertainty, and we have to use slightly different methods. But it's a matter of degree, not a matter of sort, I think.
And so the first prize in economic sciences was awarded in 1969, which makes this the 40th anniversary. And this year marks the first time that a female laureate has received the prize. Are we now turning a corner in terms of awarding the prize to female economists?
Well, it's hard to speculate about that, in particular since we don't want to tie down future committees. I guess it's a reasonable guess. Well, it's certainly a reasonable guess that it won't be another 40 years before we see a second female laureate. At the same time, the fraction of full professors in economics who are female, it's not increasing all that fast. So I think we'll have to wait and see, and whether this is a change in trend or not. You saw the chemistry prize. It's the first female this year since 1963.
45 years.
So,
but, and hopefully awarding the prize this year will provide some form of inspiration.
Yes, I think that's the nice thing, I believe. At least it proves to young scholars that it's not necessary to be male in order to win these prizes.
It's a positive message. So final question, have you managed to contact both laureates?
Yes, we have.
And how did they react?
Well, they were both very pleased, of course, and as they said, humbled. And I guess they need to have some time to take in the full ramifications of obtaining this award. In the case of Williamson, he was woken up at 3:30 in the night. So I guess in particular for him, it will take some time to digest.
Probably will. Professor Ellingson, thank you very much.
Thank you.